Sometimes evil thinks it can hide behind money and power, but there are moments when justice finds its own way to shine through. In a small courthouse, where fear had silenced too many voices, one woman's tears would finally be heard by someone who could do something about it. Young Lila May sat trembling as her husband, Roy Braddock, leaned close and whispered his threat. "You're dead when we leave." The courtroom went quiet. Roy owned half the valley and figured his word was law. But in the back row sat Silas Creed, a man who'd risen from nothing to become the richest cattle baron west of the Pecos. When Roy made his threat, Silas stood up. What he did next would change everything. Could one man's wealth and courage be enough to save an innocent woman from a monster? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Clifton County's weathered courthouse steps, where 3 generations of families had sought justice, though precious few had found it. Inside, the air hung thick with the scent of old wood and worn leather, punctuated by the nervous breathing of those who dared to bring their troubles before Judge Harrison Webb. The courthouse Bible, its leather cover cracked and softened by countless hands seeking solace, rested on the bench like a silent witness to decades of broken promises. Lila May Braddock pressed her handkerchief to her swollen left eye, the purple bruise a testament to her husband's latest rage. At 23, she should have been in the bloom of youth, but fear had carved lines around her green eyes that made her appear far older. Her cotton dress, once yellow as summer wheat, now bore the faded gray of too many washings and too many tears. She sat in the front row of the courthouse, her small frame dwarfed by the weight of what she was about to do. "Mrs. Braddock," Judge Webb's voice carried the weariness of a man who'd seen too much suffering. "You may approach the bench." Roy Braddock shifted in his chair, his massive frame straining against his Sunday suit. At 35, he commanded respect through fear. 6 feet, 4 inches of rancher's muscle, topped with a shock of red hair that matched his temper. The Braddock name had held sway in this valley for 2 generations, ever since his grandfather claimed 3,000 acres along the river bottom. Roy's hands, scarred from years of working cattle and breaking horses, now clenched and unclenched as he watched his wife rise on unsteady legs. "Your Honor," Lila May's voice barely rose above a whisper. "I'm asking for protection. I'm asking for help." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. In the gallery, townspeople shifted uncomfortably. Mary Fletcher, who ran the general store, stared at her hands. Doc Morrison, who'd treated Lila May's injuries more times than he cared to, cleared his throat and looked away. They all knew the truth, but speaking it aloud in front of Roy Braddock was another matter entirely. Roy's lawyer, a thin man named Pemberton, who wore his moral flexibility like a badge, stood to object. "Your Honor, my client disputes any allegations." "Sit down, Pemberton," Judge Webb growled. "The woman has a right to speak." In the back row, Silas Creed observed the proceedings with the quiet intensity of a man who'd learned to read people the way others read newspapers. At 58, his weathered face bore the marks of a hard life, a scar along his left jaw from a knife fight in Dodge City, crow's feet carved by years of squinting into prairie sun, hands that had known both poverty and plenty. His black coat, tailored in San Francisco, spoke of his current station, but his gray eyes held memories of hungrier times. Silas had arrived in Clifton County 5 years ago, with nothing but a saddlebag and a reputation that traveled ahead of him like thunder before lightning. Some said he'd made his fortune in silver mines up in Colorado. Others whispered about cattle deals that stretched from Texas to Montana. What everyone agreed on was that Silas Creed had the golden touch. Everything he invested in turned profitable. Every business decision seemed blessed by Providence itself. Now he owned the largest spread in 3 counties, employed half the men in town, and had enough money to buy and sell the Braddock Ranch 10 times over. But wealth hadn't softened him. If anything, it had sharpened his edges, honed his instincts to a razor's keenness that made lesser men uncomfortable. "Tell the court what happened, Mrs. Braddock," Judge Webb prompted gently. Lila May's hands shook as she touched the bruise on her face. "Last night, Roy came home from the saloon. He was angry about something. A cattle deal that fell through, I think. He said it was my fault for bringing him bad luck." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "He grabbed me by the hair and threw me against the kitchen wall. Then he hit me. Not the first time, Your Honor. Won't be the last unless something changes." Roy's face flushed red as fresh blood. "That's a damned lie." "Mr. Braddock," Judge Webb's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "You'll keep silent or I'll hold you in contempt." Lila May continued, each word costing her dearly. "When I fell down, I knocked over the water pitcher. It broke, and Roy said I'd have to pay for it. He said—" She paused, gathering courage like a woman collecting scattered pearls. "He said I was worthless, that he should have married Sarah Collins when he had the chance. Then he told me if I ever embarrassed him in public, he'd make sure I never embarrassed anyone again." The courthouse had fallen so quiet that the tick of the wall clock sounded like a hammer on anvil. Outside, a meadowlark sang its liquid song, oblivious to the human drama unfolding within these walls. "Mrs. Braddock," Judge Webb said carefully, "are you asking this court for a legal separation?" Before Lila May could answer, Roy Braddock rose to his feet like a mountain coming to life. "Now you listen here, Judge. That woman is my wife, bought and paid for. I gave her father $200 and a prize bull for her hand in marriage. She's my property, same as my cattle or my horses, and what I do with my property is my business." The casual brutality of his words struck the courtroom like a physical blow. Several women gasped. Even Pemberton, Roy's own lawyer, winced at his client's crude declaration. Judge Webb's face darkened. "Mr. Braddock, this is a court of law, not a cattle auction. Your wife is a human being with rights under—" "Rights?" Roy's laugh was ugly as a vulture's cry. "Judge, you know how things work in this county. My family's been here since before you put on that black robe. We employ half the men in this room, buy goods from the other half. You want to upset that balance over one whiny woman?" It was then that Roy made his fatal mistake. He turned to face his wife, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the courtroom. "You're dead when we leave." The words fell into the silence like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of shock through the gathered townspeople. Mary Fletcher covered her mouth with her hand. Doc Morrison's face went pale. Even Pemberton looked stricken, realizing his client had just threatened murder in front of dozens of witnesses. But it was Silas Creed's reaction that would change everything. The wealthy rancher rose from his seat with the fluid grace of a man half his age, his boot heels ringing on the wooden floor as he walked down the center aisle. Every eye in the courthouse turned to watch him approach the front of the courtroom, his black coattails flowing behind him like the wings of an avenging angel. "Your Honor," Silas's voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "I'd like to address the court." Judge Webb looked puzzled. "Mr. Creed, you're not party to these proceedings." "I am now." Silas reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio. From it He produced a document that he placed carefully on the judge's desk. "That's the deed to my ranch, all 30,000 acres, including mineral and water rights. Current assessed value is $600,000. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Even Roy Braddock's face showed confusion mixed with growing anger. "Mr. Creed," Judge Webb studied the document with careful attention. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm offering this property as security for Mrs. Braddock's protection. If any harm comes to her, any harm at all, the deed transfers immediately to her name. She becomes one of the wealthiest women west of the Mississippi." Silas turned to face Roy directly, his grey eyes hard as winter stone. "And Mr. Braddock loses any claim to her or her property." Roy's face went from red to purple. "You can't do that. She's my wife." "Not if she chooses otherwise," Silas replied calmly. "Mrs. Braddock, I'm also prepared to offer you employment as my ranch manager. The position comes with a house of your own, a fair wage, and my personal guarantee that no man will raise a hand to you again." Lila May stared at him as if he'd just offered to lasso the moon. I don't understand. Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me." Silas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the courthouse Bible on the judge's bench. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of old memories and older pain. "I had a sister once. Name was Ellen. She married young, like you did. Married a man who thought his fists were the solution to every problem." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I was away, making my fortune, thinking money was the most important thing in the world. By the time I came back, it was too late. Ellen was in the ground, and her husband was telling folks she'd had an accident with a runaway horse." The courthouse had become so quiet that the scratching of the court clerk's pen sounded like thunder. Silas looked directly at Lila May, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip. Not fear, but recognition. The recognition of someone who understood. "I swore on Ellen's grave that I'd never let another woman suffer what she suffered. Not if I had the power to prevent it." He gestured toward the deed on the judge's bench. "Today I have that power. Question is, Mrs. Braddock, do you have the courage to take it?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Lila May looked at her husband, at his face twisted with rage and disbelief. Then she looked at Silas Creed, this strange man who'd just offered her something she'd never dared to dream of: freedom. Her voice, when it came, was stronger than it had been all morning. "Yes, Mr. Creed. I do." Roy Braddock's roar shook the courthouse windows like thunder rolling across the prairie. "You son of a bitch! That's my wife!" He lunged forward, his massive fists swinging toward Silas, but Deputy Marshal Tom Garrett was quicker. The lawman's hand clamped down on Roy's shoulder with the authority of 20 years keeping the peace. "Sit down, Roy, before I put you in irons." Garrett's voice carried the quiet menace of a man who'd faced down rustlers and road agents without flinching. "You just threatened a woman's life in front of God and everybody. Don't make it worse." Judge Webb's gavel cracked 3 times in rapid succession. "Order. Order in this court." His face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "Mr. Braddock, you will return to your seat immediately, or I'll find you in contempt and have you dragged to a cell." Roy's chest heaved like a winded bull, but he slowly backed away from Silas. His eyes, however, never left the wealthy rancher's face. "This ain't over, Creed. Not by a long shot. No," Silas agreed quietly. "I don't imagine it is." Judge Webb turned his attention to the deed lying on his desk, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he examined the legal document. The courthouse Bible seemed to watch over the proceedings, its worn leather cover catching the morning light that streamed through the tall windows. "Mr. Creed," the judge said carefully, "this is most irregular. I've never seen a property deed used as surety in a domestic dispute. The law allows for creative remedies when traditional ones fail, Your Honor." Silas had clearly thought this through. "Mrs. Braddock needs protection that extends beyond these courthouse walls. A restraining order is just paper. It won't stop a bullet or a fist in the dark. But the threat of losing 30,000 acres and $600,000 in assets might give Mr. Braddock pause." Pemberton, Roy's lawyer, finally found his voice. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. Mr. Creed has no standing in this matter. He can't simply insert himself into a marriage dispute because he feels charitable." "Can't he?" Judge Webb's bushy eyebrows rose. "Mrs. Braddock, do you accept Mr. Creed's offer of employment and protection?" Lila May looked around the courtroom, seeing the faces of people she'd known all her life. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared uncomfortable, and a few seemed downright hostile. She understood their position. Roy Braddock was a powerful man, and taking his side was the safe choice. But safe choices had led her to this moment, sitting in a courthouse with a bruised face and fear in her heart. Maybe it was time to try something different. "I do, Your Honor." The words fell into the courtroom like a stone into water, sending ripples through the assembled crowd. Mary Fletcher nodded approvingly. Doc Morrison allowed himself a small smile, but others looked worried, perhaps already calculating how Roy's anger might affect their own businesses and families. Judge Webb studied the deed again, then looked up at Silas. "Mr. Creed, you're putting considerable wealth at risk for a woman you barely know. Are you certain about this course of action?" "More certain than I've been about anything in years, Your Honor." "Very well." Judge Webb lifted his pen and began writing. "Let the record show that on this day, Lila May Braddock has accepted employment with Silas Creed as ranch manager of the Double Creek Ranch. The position includes housing separate from her marital home and protection under Mr. Creed's authority. Furthermore, should any harm befall Mrs. Braddock, the property deed filed today as document 847 shall transfer immediately to her ownership." As the judge wrote, Silas removed something else from his coat pocket, a silver pocket watch, its case engraved with intricate scroll work. He checked the time, then looked directly at Roy. "It's 11:30 now, Braddock. I suggest you use the next few hours to think carefully about your choices. Mrs. Braddock will be collecting her personal belongings at 2 o'clock this afternoon. I'll be accompanying her." Roy's face twisted with rage and humiliation. He'd come to court expecting to watch his wife grovel and return home chastened. Instead, she was walking away with more money and power than he could ever dream of possessing. "She can't just leave," he sputtered. "We're married in the eyes of God and the law." "She's not leaving," Judge Webb corrected. "She's accepting employment. The marriage remains legally intact unless she chooses to pursue other remedies." He fixed Roy with a stern look. "But if I were you, Mr. Braddock, I'd consider this an opportunity for reflection rather than retaliation." Lila May stood on unsteady legs, still hardly believing what had just transpired. An hour ago, she'd been a powerless woman trapped in a loveless marriage. Now she was, what? The manager of the largest ranch in 3 counties. It seemed impossible, like something from one of the dime novels Mary Fletcher sold at the general store. "Mrs. Braddock," Silas offered her his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. "Shall we discuss your new responsibilities?" As they walked toward the courthouse door, Roy's voice followed them like a curse on the wind. "You think you can buy her away from me, Creed? You think your money makes you untouchable?" Silas paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the door handle. When he turned back, his expression was as calm as a mountain lake, but something dangerous moved in its depths. "I think, Mr. Braddock, that you've just learned the difference between having power and having money. Power comes from fear, and fear only lasts as long as people believe you can hurt them more than they can hurt you." He smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Money, on the other hand, is more permanent. It builds hospitals, buys judges, and hires men with badges and guns. Money, properly applied, can make a man like you disappear entirely. The courthouse fell dead silent. Even Deputy Garrett seemed to hold his breath, waiting to see how Roy would respond to what could only be interpreted as a threat. Roy's hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white with strain. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm educating you," Silas replied softly. "Mrs. Braddock is under my protection now. That protection extends to every facet of her life, her safety, her reputation, her peace of mind. Should anything unfortunate happen to her, I'll spend every dollar I have and call in every favor I'm owed to ensure that justice is served. And I have a great many dollars, Mr. Braddock, a great many favors." He tipped his hat to Judge Webb. "Good day, Your Honor. I trust we understand each other." With that, Silas Creed escorted Lila Mae Braddock out of the courthouse and into the bright morning sun, leaving behind a room full of stunned spectators and one furious husband whose world had just been turned upside down. Outside on the courthouse, steps. Lila Mae finally allowed herself to breathe. The spring air felt different somehow, cleaner, lighter, full of possibility instead of dread. "Mr. Creed," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something directly." "Of course." "Why? Really why? I know what you said about your sister, and I'm sorry for your loss. But this—" She gestured toward the courthouse door. "This is more than charity. This is war. You just declared war on the most powerful man in the county for someone you met an hour ago." Silas was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes scanning the street as if memorizing every detail. His hand went unconsciously to the silver pocket watch in his vest, and Lila Mae caught a glimpse of something engraved on its back. A woman's name, perhaps, though she couldn't quite make it out. "You're right," he said finally. "It is war. And I've been looking for this particular fight for a very long time." Before she could ask what he meant, the courthouse door burst open behind them. Roy Braddock stood framed in the doorway, his face purple with rage, his voice carrying clearly across the town square. "2 o'clock, Lila Mae. When you come for your things, you come alone. And Creed," he pointed a thick finger at the wealthy rancher, "stay off my land. Dead wife or not, you're not welcome at the Braddock place." The mention of Ellen hit Silas like a physical blow. His entire body went still, and when he looked back at Roy, Lila Mae saw something in his eyes that made her shiver, despite the warm morning sun. "Oh, Mr. Braddock," Silas said softly, "I'm afraid you've just made this personal." The Double Creek Ranch sprawled across the valley floor like a small kingdom, its boundaries marked by split-rail fences that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Silas guided his black gelding down the winding road that led to the main house, with Lila Mae riding beside him on a gentle mare he'd borrowed from the livery stable. The morning's events felt like a dream to her, or perhaps a nightmare from which she was finally awakening. "It's beautiful," she said softly, taking in the sight of cattle grazing in emerald pastures dotted with wildflowers. Mountains rose in the distance like purple sentinels, their snow-capped peaks catching the afternoon light. "It's home," Silas replied simply. or it has been for the past 5 years. As they approached the ranch headquarters, Lila May marveled at the scale of the operation. The main house was a 2-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wide wraparound porch that spoke of evenings spent watching sunsets. Outbuildings dotted the immediate area, a massive barn, corrals, a bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a separate cottage nestled among cottonwood trees. "That's where you'll be staying," Silas pointed toward the cottage. "It was built for my foreman, but Jake prefers the bunkhouse with the other hands, says it keeps him closer to the work." Before they could dismount, a weathered man emerged from the barn, moving with the bow-legged gait of someone who'd spent more time in the saddle than on the ground. Jake Morrison, no relation to Doc Morrison despite the shared surname, had been foreman of the Double Creek since Silas bought the place. At 62, his hair was white as fresh snow, but his blue eyes remained sharp as broken glass. "Boss?" Jake nodded toward Silas, then tipped his hat respectfully to Lila May. "Mom." "Jake, I'd like you to meet Lila May Braddock. She'll be joining us as ranch manager." If Jake was surprised by this announcement, he didn't show it. Years of working cattle and dealing with the unpredictable nature of ranch life had taught him to take things as they came. "Welcome to the Double Creek, Mrs. Braddock. Any particular experience with ranch management?" Lila May felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. No, not really. I helped my father with our small place before I married, but nothing like this." "She'll learn quickly," Silas said firmly. "Jake, I want you to show her everything. Books, breeding records, feed schedules, the whole operation. Consider her your partner, not your replacement." Jake studied Lila May with the assessing gaze of a man who'd hired and fired dozens of cowboys over the years. Whatever he saw in her face seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded slowly. "Fair enough. We can start with the cottage, get you settled, then take a tour of the place." He glanced at the sun, which was climbing toward its zenith. "Might want to hurry, though. Word travels fast in a small county, and I expect we'll have visitors before long." As if summoned by his words, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon, riders coming hard toward the ranch. Silas shielded his eyes against the sun and cursed softly under his breath. "Roy?" Lila May's voice was barely a whisper. "Looks like it. 3 men, maybe 4. Silas dismounted and helped Lila May down from her horse. "Jake, get Mrs. Braddock inside the cottage. Lock the door and don't come out until I give the all clear. Now hold on, boss." Jake's weathered face creased with concern. "Roy Braddock's got a mean streak wider than the Pecos. You sure you want to face him alone?" "I'm sure." Silas reached into his saddlebag and withdrew something that made both Jake and Lila May gasp. A Colt revolver with ivory grips, its barrel gleaming like polished steel. He checked the cylinder with practiced efficiency, then slipped the weapon into a shoulder holster beneath his black coat. This conversation was always going to happen. Better to have it on my ground than his. Lila May grabbed his arm as he turned toward the approaching riders. "Please don't do this because of me. I can go back." "No." The word came out sharper than he'd intended, and Silas softened his tone when he saw her flinch. "Mrs. Braddock, Lila May, you made your choice in that courthouse. I made mine. Neither of us is backing down now." From his vest pocket, he withdrew the silver watch again, opening it to reveal not just the time, but a small photograph tucked inside the cover. Even at a distance, Lila May could see it was a picture of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Ellen?" she asked quietly. "My sister." This was hers before she married. His thumb traced the engraved scroll work on the watch's case. "She gave it to me when I left home to seek my fortune. Said it would remind me that family was more important than money. His jaw tightened. Took me too long to learn that lesson. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Jake grabbed Lila May's elbow with surprising gentleness. "Come on, Mom. Let's get you settled while the boss handles this." The cottage was small but comfortable, with hand-hewn furniture and windows that looked out over the ranch yard. Jake quickly checked the locks on the doors and windows, his movements efficient and purposeful. "Mrs. Braddock," he said, "I need you to understand something about Silas Creed. He's not just rich, he's dangerous. Before he came here, he was a different kind of man entirely. The kind of man other dangerous men feared." "What do you mean?" "I mean he's killed men, not in anger or passion, but cold and calculating when necessary. He doesn't talk about his past much, but I've pieced together enough to know he wasn't always a respectable rancher." Jake's blue eyes held hers steadily. "Point is, Roy Braddock thinks he's facing a soft businessman with too much money and too little sense. He's wrong. Dead wrong." Through the cottage window, they could see Silas standing in the ranch yard, his hands hanging loose at his sides, but ready to move at an instant's notice. His black coat stirred in the prairie wind like the wings of a waiting vulture. The riders came into view, Roy Braddock leading 3 of his ranch hands, all armed and looking for trouble. Roy's face was still flushed with rage, but his men appeared less certain about their mission. Facing down a wealthy rancher on his own property was different from bullying townspeople who depended on Braddock money for their livelihood. "Creed," Roy's voice carried clearly across the yard as he reined in his horse 20 feet from where Silas waited. "I've come for my wife." "Your wife isn't here," Silas replied calmly. "But my ranch manager is, and she's under my protection." Roy's laugh was harsh as a crow's caw. "Protection? From what?" "From you." The simple words hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Roy's face darkened further, and his hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip. "I don't think you understand the situation, Creed. That woman belongs to me. I paid good money for her, and I mean to take her home where she belongs." Silas's voice, when he replied, was soft as silk and twice as deadly. "Mr. Braddock, I believe you're the one who doesn't understand the situation." Inside the cottage, Jake's weathered hands found his own revolver, checking the chambers with the unconscious expertise of a man who'd lived through range wars and cattle rustling raids. "This is about to get interesting," he muttered. The silver watch in Silas's pocket seemed to tick louder, marking the seconds until violence erupted across the peaceful ranch yard. The tension in the ranch yard stretched taut as a fiddle string, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Roy Braddock sat his horse like a king surveying his domain, but something in Silas Creed's stillness seemed to unnerve him. The wealthy rancher hadn't moved so much as an inch since the riders arrived, yet he somehow commanded the space around him, like a general on a battlefield. "I'll ask you once more, Creed." Roy's voice carried less bluster now, more calculation. "Send my wife out, and we'll ride away peaceful-like. No need for this to get ugly." "And I'll tell you once more, Braddock," Silas replied, his tone conversational, but his eyes never leaving Roy's gun hand. "The lady made her choice in front of God and the law. She stays." One of Roy's men, a lean cowpoke named Briggs, shifted nervously in his saddle. "Boss, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Briggs!" Roy's attention remained fixed on Silas. "You know what I think, Creed? I think you're bluffing. I think underneath all that fancy tailoring and polite talk, you're just another tin horn gambler who got lucky with some investments. Question is, are you lucky enough to outdraw 4 men?" From the cottage window, Lila May watched the standoff with her heart hammering against her ribs. Jake's weathered hand rested on his gun butt, ready to provide assistance if needed, but his attention was focused entirely on Silas. "Watch his shoulders," Jake murmured, more to himself than to her. "Man telegraphs his intentions through his shoulders." "What?" Lila May whispered. "You're Mr. Creed. He's about to show these boys why smart men don't back him into corners." In the yard, Silas finally moved, not toward his weapon, but to his vest pocket, where he withdrew a leather billfold thick with banknotes. He counted out several bills and held them up where everyone could see. $500, he announced calmly. "More money than any of you men will see in 2 years of honest work. It's yours if you ride away now and forget you were ever here." Roy's men exchanged glances. $500 was a fortune to working cowboys, enough to buy their own spread or live comfortably for months. But accepting the money would mean crossing their boss, and Roy Braddock was known for his long memory and longer reach. "Don't listen to him," Roy snarled. "He's trying to buy you off because he knows he can't take us all." "Can't I?" Silas's voice carried a hint of amusement that somehow made him sound more dangerous, not less. "Tell me, Mr. Braddock, what do you know about my time in Colorado? I know you made money in the silver mines." "Did I?" Silas smiled, but it was the expression of a wolf showing its teeth. "Is that what folks say?" Roy's confidence flickered for just a moment. "What are you getting at?" "I'm getting at the fact that you've done poor research, Mr. Braddock." "Yes, I made money in Colorado, but not in the mines." Silas tucked the money back into his pocket, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "I made it hunting claim jumpers, cattle rustlers, and men who thought they could take what belonged to others. The territorial governor paid me $500 for every wanted poster I cleared from his desk." The words hit the 4 horsemen like cold water. Bounty hunting was a dangerous profession that attracted hard men with fast guns and flexible consciences. If Silas Creed had made his fortune collecting bounties, it meant he'd face down dozens of desperate men and lived to tell about it. "You're lying," Roy said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Silas reached into another pocket and produced a small leather case. From it, he withdrew a tarnished badge that caught the afternoon sun. "Deputy United States Marshal, Colorado Territory, commissioned by Judge Isaac Parker himself." He pinned the badge to his vest with practiced ease. "Funny thing about federal appointments, Mr. Braddock. They don't expire when you cross state lines." Jake let out a low whistle from the cottage. "Well, I'll be damned. Always wondered where he learned to handle himself." Roy's men were looking increasingly uncomfortable. Facing down a rich rancher was one thing. Confronting a federal marshal with a reputation for violence was another matter entirely. Even Briggs, the most loyal of Roy's hands, was edging his horse backward. "Now then," Silas continued conversationally, "let's discuss your options. You can accept my generous offer of $500 and ride away. You can try to take Mrs. Braddock by force and discover what happens when you threaten a federal witness under my protection. Or," his hand finally moved toward his coat, "you can draw those guns and we'll settle this the way your kind usually settles things." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Roy's face had gone pale beneath his whiskers, but pride and anger warred with common sense. He'd come too far and said too much to back down without losing face entirely. "Federal witness to what?" he demanded. "Why, to your threat against her life, of course. Made in front of 24 witnesses in a court of law. Judge Webb was kind enough to make it part of the official record." Silas's smile grew wider and significantly less pleasant. "Threatening to kill a woman under federal protection is a hanging offense. Mr. Braddock. Even in Texas. Briggs had heard enough. "Boss, I ain't drawing on no federal marshal for $40 a month and found. This has gone too far." He wheeled his horse around and spurred it toward the road, not looking back. The other two men hesitated for only a moment before, following his lead, leaving Roy alone in the ranch yard with a man who wore a deputy marshal's badge and the reputation to back it up. "Cowards!" Roy shouted after his fleeing men, but his voice cracked on the word. "Smart men," Silas corrected. "They recognized a losing hand when they saw one." Roy's hand hovered near his gun, trembling with rage and humiliation. "This isn't over, Creed. Badge or no badge, I won't let you steal my wife." "She's not stolen, Mr. Braddock. She's rescued." Silas's voice went deadly quiet. "And if you come onto my land again with violent intentions, I'll kill you where you stand. That's not a threat. It's a promise backed by federal authority and personal conviction." The silver watch in Silas's vest seemed to tick louder in the sudden silence, counting down the seconds until Roy would have to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. From the cottage, Lila May watched her husband's face cycle through rage, fear, and finally a cold calculation that chilled her blood. She knew that expression, had seen it the night he'd broken her ribs and told the doctor she'd fallen down the stairs. Roy Braddock wasn't backing down. He was planning. 3 days had passed since Roy's humiliating retreat from the Double Creek Ranch, and an uneasy peace had settled over the valley like morning mist. Lila May found herself falling into a rhythm she'd never known before, rising with the sun, not from fear of her husband's temper, but from genuine purpose. Jake Morrison had proven to be a patient teacher, showing her the ledger books that tracked everything from cattle births to feed costs with meticulous precision. "See here," Jake pointed to a column of figures in the ranch records. "This shows our spring calf crop. 237 head, with only 6 lost to predators or sickness. That's better than most outfits manage." Lila May studied the neat handwriting, marveling at the complexity of the operation. How do you keep track of it all? Practice and patience. Mr. Creed's got a head for numbers that'd make a bank president jealous, but he likes to see everything written down, proper-like. Jake turned the page, revealing more columns of data. Truth is, running a ranch is like running a small town. You got to know every detail, or little problems become big ones real quick. From his desk in the ranch office, Silas looked up from a telegram he'd been reading, his expression troubled. The communication had arrived that morning from his contacts in Denver, inquiries about Roy Braddock's business dealings and debts. What he'd learned was disturbing. "Lila May," he called softly, "could I have a word with you privately?" She followed him onto the office porch, where the afternoon breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and distant rain. Silas held the telegram in his weathered hands, the paper fluttering slightly in the wind. "I've been doing some investigating into your husband's financial situation. What I've found, well, it explains a great deal about his desperation." "What do you mean?" "Roy Braddock is bankrupt, has been for months. He owes money to banks in 3 territories, and his ranch is mortgaged beyond its value. The cattle he's been selling belong to his creditors, not him." Silas folded the telegram carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket. "In legal terms, he's been operating fraudulently for the better part of a year." Lila May felt her knees go weak. "But the ranch looks prosperous. He always had money for the saloon, for new horses, borrowed money, all of it. And now his creditors are closing in." Silas's grey eyes met hers with gentle sympathy. "There's something else. The $200 he paid your father for your hand in marriage. That was stolen from the bank in Millerville. They're still looking for the man who took it." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Her marriage hadn't just been a transaction. It had been based on theft. She'd been sold for stolen money to a man who'd been lying about everything from the beginning. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. "Because Roy Braddock has nothing left to lose. A man in that position is capable of anything." Silas withdrew something from his coat, a small Derringer pistol with a pearl handle, clearly designed for a woman's use. "I want you to keep this with you at all times. It's loaded, and the trigger pull is light. You point it and squeeze. Nothing more complicated than that." Lila May stared at the weapon as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. "I've never fired a gun in my life. Hopefully you never will. But if Roy comes for you when I'm not here—" Silas's voice hardened. "You shoot first and ask questions later. Do you understand me?" Before she could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn. But this wasn't Roy returning with more men. Instead, a lone rider was coming up the road at an easy pace, Deputy Marshal Tom Garrett, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. "Mr. Creed," Garrett nodded as he dismounted. "Mrs. Braddock, hope I'm not interrupting anything important?" "Not at all, Deputy. What brings you out this way?" Garrett's weathered face was grim. "Got some news you both need to hear. Roy Braddock's disappeared." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Silas and Lila May exchanged glances, both understanding immediately that this development changed everything. "Disappeared how?" Silas asked carefully. "His hands say he rode out yesterday morning. Told them he had business in the next county. Never came back. His horse turned up this morning, wandering loose about 5 miles south of his place. No sign of Roy anywhere." Lila May felt a chill that had nothing to do with the prairie wind. "You think something happened to him?" "Could be. Or could be he lit out ahead of his creditors. Word is the bank's sending men to foreclose on his place come Monday morning." Garrett's sharp eyes studied both of their faces. "Either way, I thought you should know. If he's dead, you're a widow. If he's running, he might try to take you with him." From his vest pocket, Silas withdrew the silver watch, checking the time with movements that had become habitual. The photograph of Ellen seemed to watch him from within the watch case, reminding him of promises made and debts that could never be repaid. "Deputy," Silas said slowly, "I want guards posted around this ranch. Federal marshals if you can arrange it. If Roy Braddock is alive and planning something desperate, I won't have Mrs. Braddock caught unprepared." "Already thought of that." Garrett touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Got 2 men coming down from Fort Collins tomorrow. They'll set up a perimeter and keep watch." As the deputy prepared to leave, he paused and looked directly at Lila May. "Ma'am, I know this is a difficult situation, but I need to ask. If Roy is alive and he comes for you, what are your intentions?" "I don't understand. What I mean is, are you planning to go with him? Try to work things out? Or are you committed to staying here under Mr. Creed's protection?" The question forced Lila May to confront something she'd been avoiding for 3 days. In the courthouse, accepting Silas's offer had seemed like the only alternative to certain death. But now, with time to think and the immediate danger seemingly past, she had to decide what kind of life she actually wanted. "I'm staying," she said firmly. "Whatever happens, I'm staying here." Garrett nodded approvingly. "Good. That makes my job easier." He mounted his horse and gathered the reins. "Keep that Derringer handy, Mrs. Braddock. And Mr. Creed, watch your back. Dead or alive, Roy Braddock's got friends who might not appreciate how this situation's turned out." As the deputy rode away, Silas and Lila May stood together on the porch, both lost in their own thoughts. The silver watch ticked steadily in Silas's pocket, marking time toward an uncertain future. "Mr. Creed," Lila May said quietly, "why did you really come to that courthouse? Don't tell me it was coincidence." Silas was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old regrets and older pain. "Because I heard what he did to you. Word gets around in a small county, especially when the doctor treats the same woman for accidents, month after month." He looked at her directly, and she saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression. "I sat in my big house, with all my money and all my comfort, and I did nothing. Just like I did nothing when Ellen needed help." The admission hung between them like a bridge across dangerous water, an understanding that this had never been about charity or even simple justice. It had been about redemption, about a man trying to save a sister he'd already lost. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering, over the mountains, promising rain before nightfall. But neither of them moved from the porch, both sensing that whatever came next would test everything they'd built in these 3 precious days of peace. The storm that had threatened all evening finally broke just after midnight, sending sheets of rain across the valley and turning the ranch yard into a muddy quagmire. Lila May lay awake in her cottage bedroom, listening to the thunder roll across the mountains like distant cannon fire. The pearl-handled derringer rested on her nightstand, its presence both comforting and terrifying. She'd been thinking about what Silas had told her, about Roy's debts, about the stolen money, about the precarious foundation upon which her entire adult life had been built. Everything she'd believed about her marriage, her husband, even her father's decision to arrange the union, had been based on lies. A sudden crack of lightning illuminated her window, and in that brief flash, she thought she saw something moving near the barn. Probably just one of the ranch hands checking on the horses. Storms made the animals nervous, and Jake had mentioned they'd need to keep watch. But as she peered through the rain-streaked glass, another lightning flash revealed a figure that definitely wasn't one of Silas's men. The shape was too tall, too broad-shouldered, and it moved with a furtive purpose that made her blood run cold. Roy. She grabbed the derringer with trembling hands and crept to the cottage's back door, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Through the small window beside the door, she could see the main house where Silas slept, but it might as well have been a mile away. Between her cottage and safety lay 50 yards of open ground and whatever twisted plan Roy had brought with him. The smart thing would be to stay inside, lock the doors, and pray the federal marshals arrived before Roy could do whatever he'd come to do. But as she watched, she saw him approach the barn where Jake kept his personal horse, a loyal old mare named Sunshine that had carried him faithfully for 15 years. Roy was carrying something in his hands, something that glinted wetly in the lightning flashes. A knife. Understanding hit her like a physical blow. He wasn't here to take her away or even to hurt her directly. He was here to destroy what Silas valued, to strike at the heart of the ranch operation and send a message that nowhere was safe from his reach. Without thinking, she opened the cottage door and stepped into the storm. The rain soaked through her nightgown instantly, plastering the thin cotton to her skin and making her shiver with cold and fear. But she forced herself to move across the muddy yard, the derringer clutched in both hands the way Silas had shown her. "Roy!" she called out, her voice barely audible above the thunder. "Roy, stop!" He turned at the sound of her voice, and in the next lightning flash, she saw his face, gaunt, unshaven, with the wild look of a man who'd reached the end of his rope. His clothes were torn and muddy, and there were scratches on his face that suggested he'd been sleeping rough for days. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the rain. "If it isn't my dear, devoted wife. Come to watch me work? Please don't hurt the animals. They never did anything to you." Roy's laugh was harsh as breaking glass. "Animals? Hell, Lila May, I ain't here for the animals, though I might start with them, just to get Creed's attention." He moved closer, and she could see the knife more clearly now, a long-bladed skinning knife that he'd probably use to butcher deer and cattle. In the right hands, it could kill a man as easily as a rabbit. "You ruined me," he continued, his voice rising with each word. "You and your high and mighty protector. My credit's gone, my ranch is forfeit, and half the territory thinks I'm a wife-beater and a thief." "You are a wife-beater and a thief," she replied with more courage than she felt. The words hit him like a slap. His face contorted with rage, and he took another step toward her, raising the knife. "You think you're safe now? Think your rich lover's going to protect you forever? I got news for you, woman. I know things about Silas Creed that would curl your hair. Things that would make you run screaming back to me if you had any sense." "What things?" "Ask him about the woman in Colorado. Ask him about why he really left Denver so sudden-like. Ask him." A voice cut through the storm like a blade through silk. "Ask me yourself, Braddock." Silas emerged from the shadows near the barn, moving with the fluid grace of a predator stalking prey. He was fully dressed despite the late hour, and his Colt revolver was already in his hand. Water dripped from the brim of his black hat, but his grip on the weapon remained steady. "Silas," Roy grinned, showing teeth that gleamed white in the lightning flashes. "Just the man I wanted to see. Come to rescue your lady friend again?" "I've come to end this," Silas replied quietly. "One way or another." From his vest pocket, something caught the light. Not the silver watch this time, but something else. A small, dark object that Roy seemed to recognize, because his face went pale beneath the mud and scratches. "You kept it," Roy whispered. "I kept it," Silas confirmed. "The question is, do you remember what it means?" Lila May couldn't see what passed between the two men, but the object in Silas's hand seemed to drain the fight out of Roy like air from a punctured balloon. The knife in his hand wavered, then slowly lowered. "She was my wife," Roy said, his voice suddenly hollow. "My first wife, before Lila May." "She was my sister," Silas replied. "And you killed her." The revelation hit Lila May like a thunderbolt. Ellen, the sister Silas had mentioned, had been Roy's first wife. That was why Silas had come to the courthouse that day. That was why he'd recognized the signs of abuse, why he'd been so determined to protect her. "It was an accident," Roy pleaded, but his voice lacked conviction. "She fell. The horse spooked and—" "She fell because you beat her so badly she couldn't defend herself when the horse reared. The doctor told me the truth before he died, Roy. Told me about the broken ribs, the internal bleeding, the way you made her lie about what happened." Silas stepped closer, and in his free hand, Lila May could now see what he'd been carrying, a small locket, tarnished with age, but still recognizable as women's jewelry. "Ellen gave this to me the last time I saw her alive. She said if anything happened to her, I should remember that she'd tried to be happy. Tried to make the best of a bad situation." His voice grew deadly quiet. "She died believing it was her fault, believing she deserved what you did to her." Roy's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked less like a dangerous man and more like a broken child. "I loved her. I swear to God I loved her." "Love doesn't leave bruises," Silas said simply. "Love doesn't break bones, and love sure as hell doesn't threaten death in a courthouse." The storm was beginning to pass, the thunder growing more distant, but the tension between the two men remained as electric as the lightning that had illuminated their confrontation. "So what happens now?" Roy asked, his voice barely audible. Silas raised his revolver, the barrel pointing directly at Roy's chest. In the distance, Lila May could hear the sound of approaching horses, the federal marshals, finally arriving to provide the protection that had come too late. "Now," Silas said softly, "justice gets served." The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, but before the federal marshals could arrive, another voice cut through the storm, one that made all three people freeze in the muddy ranch yard. "Put the gun down, Silas." Judge Harrison Webb emerged from the shadows near the main house, his black judicial robes replaced by a simple coat and hat, but his authority unmistakable even in the rain. Behind him walked Deputy Marshal Tom Garrett, his weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. "Judge?" Lila May's voice was barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "What I should have done 20 years ago," Webb replied grimly, "stopping a travesty of justice before it goes any further." Silas kept his revolver trained on Roy, but his attention was now divided. "This doesn't concern you, Judge. This is between me and the man who murdered my sister. Doesn't it?" Webb stepped closer, his weathered face grave in the intermittent lightning. "Tell me, Silas, when exactly did Ellen die?" "You know when?" "March 15th, 1873, the day her husband claimed she was thrown from a horse." Judge Webb nodded slowly. "And when did you arrive in Clifton County to buy the Double Creek Ranch?" 5 years ago. "What does that?" Silas stopped, his eyes narrowing. "What are you getting at, Judge?" "I'm getting at the fact that you've been living a lie for 5 years, son. A lie that's about to destroy 3 lives if we don't set it straight right here, right now." From his coat, Judge Webb withdrew a bundle of papers, official documents that crackled despite the dampness. "These are the real court records from Ellen Creed's death. Not the ones filed publicly, but the ones sealed by judicial order 23 years ago." Roy's face had gone white as bone. "Judge, you can't—" "Be quiet, Roy. You've done enough damage with your lies." Webb fixed his stern gaze on Silas. "Your sister didn't die in 1873, Silas. She died in 1868, 5 years before Roy Braddock ever laid eyes on her." The words hit the ranch yard like a physical force. Silas's gun hand wavered, his face showing the confusion of a man whose entire understanding of reality had just been shattered. "That's impossible. Roy told me. Roy told you what he thought you wanted to hear when you came hunting for him. What he should have told you was the truth." Judge Webb opened the documents, water spattering the pages as he read. Ellen Creed died in a fire at the boarding house in Denver, where she was living with her infant daughter. She was trying to escape an abusive husband, not Roy Braddock, but a man named William Hartwell. Lila May felt the world tilt around her. "Daughter?" "Ellen had a child," Webb continued remorselessly, "a little girl she was trying to protect from her husband's violence. The child survived the fire, but Ellen didn't." He looked directly at Silas. "That child was placed with a family named Collins in the next county. She grew up believing her parents had died in an epidemic." The name hit Roy like a hammer blow. "Sarah Collins," he whispered. "The woman you wanted to marry instead of me," Lila May said, understanding beginning to dawn. Judge Webb nodded. "Sarah Collins is Ellen Creed's daughter. Your niece, Silas. The woman Roy has been carrying a torch for all these years is your flesh and blood." Silas staggered backward as if he'd been shot. The revolver in his hand dropped to point at the ground, forgotten in his shock. But Roy's wife, the woman he killed, Roy's first wife was named Emma Patterson. She died exactly as he described, thrown from a horse after he beat her senseless. But she wasn't your sister. Webb's voice was heavy with the weight of years of keeping this secret. Roy heard about your sister's death through mutual acquaintances and realized you'd confused the two women. Rather than correct your mistake, he let you believe what you wanted to believe. Roy found his voice, hoarse and broken. I thought, when you came to town asking questions about Ellen, I thought you were going to expose what I did to Emma. I figured if you wanted to believe Emma was your sister, that was your business, kept you from digging into the real truth. The real truth, Lila May said slowly, is that you killed an innocent woman and let another man think it was his sister. The real truth, Judge Webb corrected, is more complicated than that. He withdrew another document from his bundle. This is a letter Ellen Creed wrote to her brother 3 days before she died. She gave it to me for safekeeping, asking that it be delivered if anything happened to her. With trembling hands, Silas took the letter. The paper was yellowed with age, but Ellen's handwriting was still clear and precise. As he read, his face went through a series of emotions, confusion, sorrow, and finally something that might have been peace. She forgives me, he whispered. She says she doesn't blame me for leaving, that she made her own choices. He looked up at the judge. She says she's happy I got away before the violence touched me too. What else does it say? Lila May asked gently. She says, Silas's voice broke. She says she hopes her daughter will grow up strong and free, and that if I ever have the chance to protect someone the way I couldn't protect her, I should take it. He looked directly at Lila May. She says love isn't about blood or obligation. It's about choosing to stand between harm and the innocent. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Everything they'd believed, everything they'd fought for, had been based on a mistake. Yet somehow, in the confusion and cross-purposes, something true had emerged. So what happens now? Roy asked, his voice small and defeated. Judge Webb studied the 3 figures standing in the muddy ranch yard, the broken man who'd killed one woman and terrorized another, the wealthy rancher who'd spent years seeking justice for the wrong crime, and the young woman caught between them all. Now, he said carefully, we deal with what's real instead of what we thought was true. He turned to Roy. You're going to face justice for Emma Patterson's death. The federal marshals have warrants for your arrest on multiple charges: murder, fraud, theft, and threatening a federal witness. But you're going to serve that justice with the truth finally told. Roy nodded numbly. The fight had gone out of him entirely, replaced by something that might have been relief. And you? Webb looked at Silas. Are going to stop trying to save your sister and start protecting the woman who actually needs your help. Ellen's been dead for over 20 years, son. Let her rest. Silas looked at Ellen's locket in his hand, then at the letter that had finally brought him the peace he'd been seeking. With deliberate care, he placed both items in his vest pocket next to the silver watch. Lila May, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. I brought you into this for the wrong reasons. I wasn't trying to save you. I was trying to save Ellen. That wasn't fair to either of you. But you did save me, she replied. Maybe not for the reasons you intended. But you saved me all the same. The federal marshals finally arrived, their horses splashing through the puddles as they surrounded Roy Braddock. As they placed him in irons, he looked back at Lila May one last time. I'm sorry, he said simply. For all of it. For Emma. For you. For the lies. I'm sorry. It was the first honest thing he'd said in years. As the marshals led Roy away, Judge Webb prepared to follow them, but before leaving, he placed a fatherly hand on Silas's shoulder. "Son, you spent 5 years planning revenge for the wrong death. Don't spend the next 5 years feeling guilty about it. Ellen's letter was right. Love is about choosing to protect the innocent. You made that choice, even if your reasons got a bit tangled up along the way." With that, he climbed onto his horse and rode into the night, leaving Silas and Lila May alone in the storm's aftermath. The truth, as it turned out, was more complex than either of them had imagined. But standing together in the muddy yard, watching the rain wash away the last traces of Roy Braddock's presence, they both realized that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected circumstances, even if those circumstances begin with a lie. The dawn following Roy Braddock's arrest broke clear and bright over the Double Creek Ranch, as if the storm had washed away more than just the dust and heat of the previous days. Lila May stood on her cottage porch, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and purple, trying to make sense of everything that had changed in the span of a single night. The truth about Ellen, about Roy's real crime, about the mistaken identity that had driven 5 years of Silas's life. It should have made her feel betrayed, used as a substitute for a dead woman's memory. Instead, she found herself oddly at peace. Whatever Silas's original motivations, he had given her something precious, the chance to choose her own path. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Jake Morrison stood on her threshold, his weathered hat in his hands, looking more uncertain than she'd ever seen him. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Braddock, but Mr. Creed's asked if you'd join him in the main house. Says there's some things need discussing before the lawyers arrive from Denver." "Lawyers?" "Yes, ma'am. Seems when Roy gets sentenced for murder and fraud, his ranch will go to auction to pay his debts. Mr. Creed's thinking of bidding on it, but he wants to talk through the implications with you first." Lila May followed Jake across the yard, noting how different the ranch felt in daylight. Last night it had been a battlefield where secrets were revealed and lies exposed. Now it was simply a place where people worked and lived and tried to make something good from the land. She found Silas in his study, surrounded by legal documents and ledger books. He looked up as she entered, and she was struck by how much he'd changed since that first day in the courthouse. The driven intensity was still there, but it was tempered now with something softer. Peace, perhaps, or at least the beginning of it. "Lila May." He rose and offered her a chair. "Thank you for coming. I know last night was difficult, and I expect you have questions." "I do, but first, I want you to know that I don't feel deceived. Confused, maybe, but not deceived. You saved my life, whatever your reasons." Silas was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the edge of Ellen's letter, which lay open on his desk. "That's generous of you. More generous than I deserve." "Perhaps. But generosity isn't about what people deserve. It's about what they need." She settled into the offered chair, smoothing her skirts. "Now, what's this about Roy's ranch?" "The Braddock place will be auctioned next month. Between the mortgages and the criminal penalties, everything Roy owned will go to satisfy his debts. The question is whether I should bid on it, and if so, what that means for you." Lila May frowned. "I don't understand why my opinion matters. It's your money. Because," Silas leaned back in his chair, "I'm offering you a partnership." The words hung in the air between them, like a bridge across dangerous water. Lila May stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "A partnership? In the legal sense, I want to put the Braddock Ranch, assuming I can buy it, in your name, All of it. The land, the buildings, the remaining cattle. I'll provide the capital to restore it to profitability, but you'll be the owner. That's impossible. I don't have money for such a venture. You have something more valuable than money, Silas replied. You have the right to be there. Roy's widow inheriting his property after his conviction. That's justice served in a way that satisfies both the law and public opinion. But more than that, you have the will to make something good from something that's been twisted and broken. From his vest, Silas withdrew the silver watch, opening it to reveal Ellen's photograph. My sister wanted her daughter to grow up strong and free. Sarah Collins, Ellen's child, is now a woman of 23, living with a good family who've never told her the truth about her parents. Maybe it's time she learned, and maybe it's time she had a place to come home to if she wants one. The implications of his proposal began to sink in. You want me to restore the Braddock Ranch so that Ellen's daughter has a place to belong. I want you to restore it because it's yours by right, and because you'll do it better than anyone else could. Sarah's part of it, yes, but not the whole of it. Silas closed the watch and set it carefully on the desk. Lila May, I've spent 5 years chasing ghosts and planning revenge for a crime that happened differently than I thought. I'm tired of living in the past. I want to build something for the future. Before she could respond, Jake knocked on the study door. Boss? You've got visitors coming up the road. Looks like official business. Through the window they could see a small cavalcade approaching. 2 black carriages flanked by federal marshals, kicking up dust as they rolled toward the ranch house. The lead carriage bore the territorial seal, suggesting this was more than a routine legal matter. That'll be the territorial attorney, Silas said grimly. Roy's case is bigger than just murder and fraud. When word gets out about the scope of his financial crimes, it's going to shake confidence in half the banks from here to Denver. As they watched the carriages approach, Lila May made a decision that surprised her with its certainty. I'll do it. I'll take the partnership, buy the Braddock place, and restore it. But I have conditions. Name them. First, we find Sarah Collins and tell her the truth about her mother. She deserves to know, and to choose whether she wants any part of this legacy. Second, we do this properly. No shortcuts, no favors, no taking advantage of legal loopholes. If I'm going to own that ranch, I'm going to earn it honestly. And third, Lila May looked directly at him, her green eyes steady and sure. Third, you stop trying to save Ellen and start building a life for Silas Creed. You've carried her memory long enough. She's at peace. You said so yourself, based on that letter. Now it's time for you to find your own peace. The territorial attorney proved to be a thin, nervous man named Morrison, no relation to Jake or Doc Morrison, despite the name, who spread his papers across Silas's dining table like a general planning a campaign. With him came 2 federal marshals, a court reporter, and enough legal documentation to stock a small library. Mr. Creed, Mrs. Braddock, Attorney Morrison adjusted his spectacles nervously. We need to discuss the scope of Mr. Braddock's criminal enterprise. What we initially thought was a simple case of domestic violence and fraud has expanded into something much larger. He opened a thick folder and began laying out documents. Roy Braddock's debts extend across 3 territories and involve at least 7 banks. He's been operating what amounts to a shell game with cattle that don't belong to him, land that's mortgaged beyond its value, and promissory notes backed by assets that were sold years ago. How extensive? Silas asked. Nearly $200,000 in fraudulent transactions. When news of his arrest spreads, it's going to trigger a financial panic that could close banks and ruin honest ranchers who had legitimate business with him. Lila May felt her stomach drop. Are you saying that innocent people will suffer because of what Roy did? I'm saying that Roy Braddock's crimes are going to hurt a lot of people who trusted him. Unless we can find a way to stabilize the situation. Attorney Morrison fixed his attention on Silas. Mr. Creed, your reputation and financial standing could go a long way toward restoring confidence. If you were to guarantee Roy Braddock's legitimate debts, only the legitimate ones, it would prevent a complete collapse of credit in this part of the territory. How much would that cost? Approximately $50,000, a significant sum, but well within your means. Silas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table. Finally, he looked at Lila May. What do you think? I think, she said slowly, that this is exactly the kind of choice Ellen was talking about in her letter. Choosing to protect the innocent, even when it costs us something. Even if it means using a significant portion of the money we'd planned to invest in restoring the Braddock place. Especially then, a ranch built on other people's suffering isn't worth having. Attorney Morrison looked between them with something approaching admiration. That's a remarkable attitude, Mrs. Braddock. Most people in your position would be thinking about their own interests first. Most people, Lila May replied, haven't had the benefit of learning the difference between owning something and earning something. As the sun climbed higher over the valley, they spent the morning working through the legal complexities of Roy's downfall and their proposed solutions. By noon, the framework was in place. Silas would guarantee the legitimate debts, preventing a financial panic. The Braddock Ranch would go to public auction, where Lila May would bid for it with capital provided by their partnership. Most importantly, they would begin the process of finding Sarah Collins and giving Ellen's daughter the choice of connecting with her true family. As the attorneys and marshals prepared to leave, Attorney Morrison paused at the door. Mrs. Braddock, Mr. Creed, what you're doing here, it's going to be noticed, not just locally, but territorially. This kind of principled action in the face of personal cost is rare enough to attract attention from very powerful people. What kind of attention? Silas asked. The kind that might lead to opportunities, political opportunities, business opportunities, the kind of influence that could help you protect other people the way you've protected each other. After the officials departed, Lila May and Silas stood together on the ranch porch, watching the dust settle behind the departing carriages. The silver watch ticked steadily in Silas's vest pocket, but for the first time in years, he wasn't counting down toward some moment of reckoning. Instead, he was simply marking time as it passed, moment by moment, toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Lila May, he said quietly, are you ready for what comes next? She thought about the question seriously. In a few weeks, she'd be the owner of the ranch where she'd suffered so much. She'd be responsible for rebuilding not just buildings and herds, but trust and hope in a community shaken by betrayal. She'd be part of telling a young woman that everything she'd believed about her family was a lie, but that she had a chance to build something true from the wreckage. I'm ready, she said simply. Are you? Silas touched the watch in his pocket one last time, then let his hand fall away. I think I finally am. The auction of the Braddock Ranch took place on a crisp October morning, 3 weeks after Roy's sentencing to 20 years in the territorial prison. Half the county had turned out for the spectacle, drawn by curiosity, opportunity, or simple bloodthirsty desire to see the final chapter of a scandal that had rocked the territory's financial foundations. Lila May stood near the courthouse steps, the same steps where she'd first encountered real hope, watching as potential bidders examined the auction catalogue. Some she recognized, neighboring ranchers looking to expand their holdings, speculators from Denver hoping to profit from another man's downfall, even a representative from the railroad company that was slowly pushing its steel tentacles across the territory. "Nervous?" Silas asked quietly, appearing at her elbow with 2 cups of coffee from Mary Fletcher's general store. "Terrified," she admitted, accepting the warmth gratefully. "What if we're outbid? What if someone with deeper pockets decides they want Roy's land more than we do?" "Then we'll find another way to make things right," Silas replied, with the calm certainty that had drawn her to trust him from the beginning. "But I don't think it will come to that." He was right to be confident. Over the past 3 weeks, word had spread throughout the territory about their plan to honor Roy's legitimate debts and restore stability to the region's banking system. The gesture had earned them respect and, more importantly, had encouraged other potential bidders to look elsewhere, rather than compete against people who'd already demonstrated their commitment to the community's welfare. Auctioneer Maxwell Drummond, a bombastic man with a voice that could be heard 3 counties away, mounted the platform that had been erected in the courthouse square. In his hands, he held the brass auction hammer that had transferred ownership of countless properties over the years, another artifact in a story already rich with symbolic objects. "Ladies and gentlemen," Drummond's voice boomed across the square, "we are here today to auction the property known as the Braddock Ranch, consisting of 3,200 acres of prime grazing land, buildings, water rights, and remaining livestock. The opening bid will be set at $20,000 to cover outstanding liens and legal fees." A murmur ran through the crowd. 20,000 was a substantial sum, enough to eliminate all but the most serious bidders. Lila May felt her palms grow damp despite the cool morning air. "Do I hear $20,000? Drummond's eyes scanned the crowd. "20,000, called a voice from the back. Lila May turned to see James Whitmore, a cattle baron from the next county who owned nearly as much land as Silas himself. "25,000, Silas responded immediately, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "30,000, countered another voice. This one belonged to Harrison Burke, the railroad representative, a thin man in an expensive suit who'd been taking notes throughout the preliminary inspection. Lila May's heart sank. If the railroad wanted the land, they had virtually unlimited resources to draw upon. She started to whisper her concerns to Silas, but stopped when she noticed something unexpected happening in the crowd. Judge Webb was moving through the assembled bidders, speaking quietly to each potential competitor. Whatever he was saying, it was having an immediate effect. Whitmore nodded grimly and stepped back from the auction area. Burke's face went pale, and he hastily folded his bidding catalogue. 35,000, Silas bid again, but now there was no immediate response. "Do I hear 40,000? Drummond called. 40,000 for one of the finest ranching properties in the territory? Silence stretched across the courthouse square, like a held breath. Judge Webb completed his circuit of the crowd and caught Silas's eye, offering a barely perceptible nod. 35,000, going once, Drummond announced. Going twice, $50,000. The voice came from an unexpected source, Sarah Collins herself, stepping forward from the crowd with quiet dignity. At 23, Ellen's daughter had grown into a striking woman with her mother's gentle eyes and a strength that spoke of overcoming hardship. She'd arrived in Clifton County 2 days earlier after receiving Silas's carefully worded letter explaining her true parentage. The crowd erupted in whispers. Sarah Collins was known throughout the territory as a school teacher and respected member of her community, but nobody had expected her to have the financial resources to bid on a major ranch. "Miss Collins," Drummond looked confused. Do you have verification of your ability to cover such a bid? Sarah reached into her reticule and withdrew a bank draft that she handed to the auctioneer. I believe you'll find everything in order. Lila May stared at Silas, who looked equally surprised. This wasn't part of their plan. They'd written to Sarah to inform her of her heritage and invite her to visit, but they hadn't expected her to complicate the auction. I don't understand, Lila May whispered. Where would she get $50,000? Silas studied the young woman's face, noting the determined set of her jaw and the way she held herself with quiet authority. I think I'm beginning to, he murmured. Look at her hands. Lila May focused on Sarah's gloved hands and gasped. Even through the fabric she could see the outline of rings, multiple rings that spoke of wealth and status far beyond a schoolteacher's salary. $50,000 going once, Drummond called, his voice uncertain. Do I hear any other bids? The courthouse square had fallen completely silent. Every eye was fixed on this unexpected development, this young woman who'd just upended everyone's expectations. Going twice. Wait, Silas called out, stepping forward. Miss Collins, might I have a word with you before the bidding concludes? Sarah studied him with Ellen's eyes, seeing something in his face that made her nod slowly. Of course, Uncle Silas. The admission sent another ripple of shock through the crowd. Uncle Silas. She knew exactly who she was and why she was there. Silas, Lila May, and Sarah Collins stepped away from the auction platform to a quieter corner of the courthouse square, while auctioneer Drummond called for a 15-minute recess to allow the principals to confer. The crowd buzzed with speculation, but respectfully maintained their distance from what was clearly a family discussion. Miss Collins, Silas began carefully, I must say, your letter in response to mine was somewhat understated regarding your circumstances. Sarah smiled, and the expression transformed her face in a way that reminded both Silas and Lila May powerfully of Ellen's photograph. I learned early that honesty about one's resources can be both a blessing and a curse, Uncle Silas. The Collins family has been very good to me, but I've also made my own way in the world. She removed her gloves, revealing hands that bore the calluses of honest work alongside rings that spoke of considerable wealth. You weren't entirely forthcoming either. Your letter mentioned that you'd like me to know about my inheritance, but you failed to mention that you'd already put yourself at considerable financial risk to honor the debts of the man who killed my mother's memory. How did you... Lila May started. Banks talk to other banks, Mrs. Braddock. When someone guarantees $50,000 in fraudulent debts to prevent a territorial banking crisis, word spreads quickly through financial circles. Sarah's eyes held a shrewdness that belied her gentle appearance. I've been following the situation since I received Uncle Silas's letter. I know exactly what you've both sacrificed to make this right. She reached into her reticule again and withdrew a folded document. This is a partnership agreement drawn up by the finest legal minds in Denver. I propose that we combine our resources, your experience and local knowledge, my capital and business connections, to not just restore the Braddock Ranch, but to turn it into something that honors my mother's memory properly. Silas examined the document with growing amazement. The terms were generous beyond belief. Sarah was essentially offering to fund their entire operation while taking only a minority stake in the ownership. Miss Collins, Sarah, he said slowly, this is extraordinarily generous, but I have to ask, how does a school teacher come to possess this kind of wealth? Sarah's laugh was musical, like wind chimes on a summer breeze. I was a school teacher, Uncle Silas, for exactly 6 months, long enough to realize that while I loved teaching, I had other talents that could serve a greater purpose." She gestured toward the courthouse, where Judge Webb was engaged in animated conversation with several of the disappointed bidders. "Do you see that man talking to the judge? Harrison Burke, railroad representative?" "Yes. He's been trying to acquire ranch land along this route for 2 years. The railroad needs the land, but they've been offering unfair prices and using questionable tactics to force sales. I've been buying up properties ahead of them, then negotiating fair deals that benefit both the landowners and the railroad." Lila May stared at her. "You're a land speculator." "I'm a businesswoman who believes that everyone deserves fair treatment. The Collins family taught me the value of education, but they also taught me that money is a tool. It can be used to help or to hurt, depending on the character of the person wielding it." She pointed to the rings on her fingers, each one clearly distinct and valuable. "Each of these represents a successful negotiation where nobody got cheated and everyone came away better than they started. I've made considerable profit, yes, but I've also prevented a dozen families from losing their homes to railroad bullying." Silas was quiet for a long moment, studying the young woman's face and seeing not just Ellen's features, but something else, a strength and purpose that reminded him of someone else entirely. "You remind me of myself," he said finally, "when I was hunting claim jumpers and cattle rustlers, using whatever tools I had to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." "Perhaps that's what family means," Sarah replied softly. "Not just shared blood, but shared purpose." Auctioneer Drummond's voice boomed across the square. "Ladies and gentlemen, if the principals are ready, we'll resume the bidding." Sarah looked between Silas and Lila May, her expression serious. "I'm prepared to bid whatever it takes to win this auction, but I'd rather work with you than against you. What do you say?" Lila May felt a strange sense of completion, as if pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving were finally falling into place. Ellen's daughter wasn't just a lost family member to be rescued. She was a powerful ally who could help them accomplish more than they'd ever dreamed. "I say," Lila May responded, extending her hand to Sarah, "that it's time the women in this family took charge of their own destinies." Sarah clasped her hand warmly, then offered her other hand to Silas. "Uncle, are you ready to honor my mother's memory by building something she'd be proud of?" Silas looked at the two women. One he'd tried to save, the other he'd never imagined he'd find, and felt the last of his old guilt and anger finally release its hold on his heart. "I'm ready," he said, joining their handshake. "Let's go buy a ranch." As they walked back toward the auction platform, the brass hammer caught the morning sun, ready to fall on a decision that would change not just their lives, but the entire character of Clifton County for generations to come. 1 year later, Lila May stood on the porch of what had once been Roy Braddock's house, watching the sun set over a valley transformed. The building itself had been torn down and rebuilt, not out of necessity, but out of symbolism. Nothing of the old structure remained except the stone foundation, upon which they'd constructed something entirely new. The Creed Collins Ranch, as it was now known, sprawled across the restored acreage like a testament to what could be accomplished when people chose cooperation over competition. The main house was larger than Roy's had been, but more welcoming, built to accommodate not just a family, but the frequent visitors who came seeking the kind of fair dealing that had become the ranch's reputation. In the distance, she could see Silas and Sarah working with a group of potential land sellers, helping them navigate negotiations with the railroad company. What had started as a personal vendetta had evolved into something far more significant. a business that protected small ranchers and farmers from exploitation while ensuring that progress could continue without destroying lives. The silver pocket watch now sat in a place of honor on the mantelpiece inside, no longer carried as a reminder of guilt and grief, but displayed as a celebration of Ellen's enduring influence on her family. Beside it rested the courthouse Bible, gifted to them by Judge Webb when he retired, and Ellen's locket, which Sarah wore only on special occasions. Mrs. Creed. Lila May turned to find Jake Morrison approaching, his weathered face creased with the satisfied expression of a man whose faith in human nature had been vindicated. In his hands, he carried the day's mail, a stack that had grown considerably thicker since word of their operation had spread throughout the territory. 3 more requests for representation, Jake reported, settling into the rocking chair they'd placed on the porch for his use. 2 from families dealing with railroad pressure. 1 from a widow whose late husband's business partners are trying to cheat her out of his estate. Any we can't handle? None that I can see, though the widow's case might require a trip to Santa Fe. Her husband's partners have connections to the territorial government that could make things complicated. Lila May smiled at Jake's careful phrasing. After a year of working together, he still occasionally forgot to use her married name, a habit that amused rather than bothered her. The wedding had been a simple affair, conducted by Judge Webb in the same courthouse where this story had begun. Silas had proposed not with flowery speeches or romantic gestures, but with a simple question. Would you like to make this partnership official in every sense? Schedule the trip, she decided. Sarah's connections in Denver should be enough to counter any political pressure, and it sounds like the kind of case Ellen would have wanted us to take. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Sarah Collins, now Sarah Collins Creed, having chosen to hyphenate her name when she legally joined the family business, came riding up the path on her favorite mare. At 24, she'd grown into her inheritance of both wealth and responsibility, becoming the kind of woman who could negotiate million-dollar land deals in the morning and teach children to read in the afternoon. How did the Hendricks negotiation go? Lila May called out as Sarah dismounted. Better than expected. The railroad agreed to their asking price, plus compensation for relocating their cattle. The family will be able to buy a larger spread closer to town and still have money left over for their children's education. Sarah's smile was radiant with satisfaction. Mr. Hendricks actually cried when we shook hands on the deal. And the railroad? Gets the route they need for their expansion, plus a reputation for fair dealing that will make future negotiations easier. Everyone wins. It was the kind of outcome they'd become known for, solutions that honored everyone's legitimate interests while preventing exploitation. The approach had made them wealthy, but more importantly, it had made them respected. Politicians sought their advice, business leaders consulted them before major decisions, and families throughout the territory knew they had advocates who couldn't be bought or intimidated. As the 3 of them sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Lila May reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she'd been a terrified woman seeking protection from a violent husband. Now she was a partner in one of the most influential businesses in the territory, married to a man who'd learned to honor the past while building for the future, and sister-in-law to a woman who embodied the best qualities of the family they'd all lost and found. "Silas," she said softly, "do you ever regret how it all started? The mistaken identity? The years you spent planning revenge for the wrong crime?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, his thumb unconsciously tracing the spot on his vest where he used to carry the silver watch. "I regret the pain Ellen suffered, and the time I lost to anger and guilt. But regret how it led us here, how it brought us together and gave us the chance to build something that helps people. He shook his head. No. I think Ellen would say that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected directions. From inside the house came the sound of a baby's cry, strong, healthy, and demanding attention. Sarah rose with a laugh, heading inside to tend to Ellen Marie Creed, born 6 months earlier and named for the woman whose memory had brought them all together. Your daughter has excellent timing, Jake observed with amusement. Always seems to wake up just when the conversation gets philosophical. She's her mother's daughter, Silas replied with pride. Strong opinions and no patience for unnecessary sentiment. As Sarah's voice drifted through the windows, singing a gentle lullaby to the baby girl who would grow up knowing she was loved, protected, and expected to make her own mark on the world, Lila May felt a deep sense of completion. The courthouse where her story had begun was visible in the distance, its windows glowing with lamplight as Deputy Garrett worked late, preparing for tomorrow's cases. The valley had found its peace, built on foundations of justice served and debts paid, of family found and love discovered. It wasn't the ending any of them had expected when that story began with threats and fear in a dusty courtroom, but it was the ending they'd earned through choices made with courage and compassion. Sometimes, Lila May thought, as she listened to her daughter's contented sighs from the nursery, the best stories are the ones that begin with, "You're dead when we leave," and end with, "Welcome home." The silver watch on the mantelpiece ticked steadily through the night, no longer counting down toward vengeance, but marking the gentle passage of time in a house where 3 generations had finally learned what it meant to be family.